Hello and welcome to the Novel Analyst Podcast. I'm Jed Hearn, and every episode I analyze a story to help you become a better writer. This episode is titled The Hitchhiker's Guide to the Galaxy by Douglas Adams, Part 1, Why Characters Don't Matter. This is the first in a two-part series on The Hitchhiker's Guide to the Galaxy. Next episode is going to be released this time next week. If you haven't read The Hitchhiker's Guide to the Galaxy, you're missing out, because it is a uproariously funny... Is that even a word? I don't know, we're going with it. It is an outrageously funny, that's the word I meant to say, sci-fi comedy about Arthur Dent, who's kind of this typical English everyman who lives in this sleepy village on the planet that's known as Earth. And his life is very ordinary, but then one day, his house is demolished, and shortly after that, he finds that Earth is about to be demolished to make way for an intergalactic highway built by these aliens called the Vogons, and he escapes from Earth, and things just get super weird from there. It's a short book, relatively fast to read. The series as a whole is got 6 books in it, I think, at this stage, touted as a trilogy of 5 at one stage, which is kind of ironic in how inaccurate it is. But for this episode, I'm going to be focusing mainly on the first 2 books, The Hitchhiker's Guide to the Galaxy and The Restaurant at the End of the Universe. But there might also be some other examples, particularly in the second part of this episode, from the entire series. So, one thing I find really interesting about The Hitchhiker's Guide to the Galaxy is that I really like this book. However, I don't find the characters particularly memorable, interesting, or compelling. I struggle to remember details about them apart from knowing that the protagonist is called Arthur Dent. And, I kind of even had to look up stuff about him before I recorded this episode because I read the book a couple of years ago. I read The Restaurant at the End of the Universe more recently. But the thing is, it doesn't matter. It doesn't matter that the characters are particularly not interesting. And that's because the story's world is so fun. It's the wacky scenarios that stick with you. It's been multiple years since I read the first book, but I can still remember a lot of funny things from it. Like in the first book, there's this big setup that this alien civilization is building a giant supercomputer to find the meaning of life, and the supercomputer goes away, says it's going to need like 7 million years or something to compute it. And then at the end of that, it says that it has the answer, and then there's like this big build up, and then it says that the answer to the meaning of life, the universe, and everything is, drumroll please, 42. Great. It doesn't make any sense at all, right? And it doesn't make any sense to the people in the novel, and it's just super absurd. So then what people in the story decide they need to do is, okay, so they found the answer to the question of the meaning of life, but now they need to find the question to the answer to the question of the meaning of life. And by going back and reverse engineering, knowing that the answer to the meaning of life is 42, they need to now find the question. So they build an even bigger computer to try to find the question to the answer to the meaning of life. That's just one of the many ridiculous, absurd scenarios that you get into this novel. What are some other good stuff in here and these are all things that I remembered without having to look up the book, look up the book's plot again, even though I've probably read the book maybe 4 or 5 years ago. Obviously, I read the second book more recently, but these are examples from the first book. And the point I'm trying to prove here is that even though I kind of forgot everything about the characters, there were lots of scenario, situational, world things that I remembered. So, for example, another one is the great joke that humans are the 3rd most intelligent animal on Earth, behind dolphins and mice, who have used their positions in laboratories to run subtle psychological experiments on the humans who are observing their behavior, the humans who stupidly think they're in control. There's also the great supreme utility of the towel in intergalactic travel, which is a big part of the novel. Here's a quote from the first book. I didn't remember this quote. I did have to look it up, but I did remember the towel thing before I looked up any plot synopsis stuff. And here's the quote. "The towel has great practical value. You can wrap it around you for warmth as you bound across the cold moons of Jaglan Beta. You can lie on it on the brilliant marble-sanded beaches of Santraginus 5, inhaling the heady sea vapors. You can sleep under it beneath the stars which shine so redly on the desert world of Kakarfrun." Man, these are weird names. "Use it to sail a mini raft down the slow, heavy river Moth. Wet it for use in hand-to-hand combat. Wrap it around your head to ward off noxic fumes or to avoid the gaze of the ravenous bug-blatter beast of Trowel, a mind-bogglingly stupid animal that assumes that if you can't see it, it can't see you. Daft as a bush, but very, very ravenous. You can wave your towel in emergencies as a distress signal, and of course dry yourself off with it if it still seems to be clean enough." End quote. Just one of the many comedic situations that's presented throughout this book. And then of course you have the frequently illogical Hitchhiker's Guide to the Galaxy itself, a literal guidebook to help hitchhikers travel around the galaxy, maybe not in comfort, maybe not in style, but they'll sure get to see some interesting sights along the way. Then you've got the infinite improbability drive, a device for letting outrageous things happen to save the story. So there's one scene where two characters are basically expelled into space at this random point in, nowhere space, and they're going to die within seconds, but they're saved within seconds by this passing starship crewed by this random acquaintance that they kind of ran into ages and ages ago. And there's just like such a small, mind-boggling odds of this happening. But the infinite improbability drive just solves all these issues, because if anything, the more outrageous something is, the more improbable it is, the more likely the infinite improbability drive is to succeed. And it's kind of amusing because this was very much a Deus Ex Machina that Douglas Adams created back in the original radio series of The Hitchhiker's Guide to the Galaxy, because I believe the story goes, and I'm not 100% sure if this is truth or not, truth or legend, but the story goes that they thought they were going to be taken off the air after their next episode, so in the next episode they just ended it by throwing the main characters outside an airlock into space. And then they found they had to continue it, and they were like, blast. Now we have to somehow solve this, and they were like, oh, how can we solve this? Let's just create something that makes improbable things happen to save our asses. And it does. And then in the sequel, The Restaurant at the End of the Universe, there's some more outrageously funny stuff. I read this book probably, maybe a month ago from the time of recording. And again, characters didn't particularly stick with me, didn't find them particularly memorable or empathetic, but it doesn't matter because there's so many funny, absurdist scenarios. So my personal favorite, and this actually might be my favorite from the whole series, is there's these sunglasses, which go black when there's danger, to prevent you from seeing the danger so that you don't harm yourself by seeing them. I think anyone with more than 2 brain cells can work out how that's going to be pretty useless, but it's a hilarious example of the absurdist comedy, which makes Hitchhiker's Guide to the Galaxy probably the best sci-fi comedy, widely regarded as one of the best. Then, of course, there's the Hitchhiker's Guide to the Galaxy's fallacy-riddled mathematics. So here's a quote that demonstrates why you probably don't want to trust the Hitchhiker's Guide to the Galaxy that much. Quote goes like this: "It is known that there are an infinite number of worlds, simply because there is an infinite amount of space for them to be in. However, not every one of them is inhabited. Therefore, there must be a finite number of inhabited worlds. Any finite number divided by infinity is as near to nothing as makes no odds, so the average population of all planets in the universe can be said to be 0. From this, it follows that the population of the whole universe is also 0, and that any people you meet from time to time are merely the products of a deranged imagination." End quote. And this kind of leads to the guide's wonderful assertion that reality is frequently inaccurate. So what is the point in me recounting all of those hilarious scenarios, apart from the fact that I just absolutely love them and wanted to relive them again? Well, like I mentioned before, the reason I bring these up is because these were all things that I was able to remember without having to necessarily revisit a plot synopsis or anything for the book. Sometimes when I'm recording these episodes, it's been a while since I've read a book, so I will look at a brief plot synopsis just to refresh myself. But all those examples there, particularly the examples from the first book, The Hitchhiker's Guide to the Galaxy, those are all things that I just was able to jot down within 5 minutes of opening the notes document for this episode. And that's because those scenarios were just wonderfully hilarious and absurdist and fit in so well with the wacky tone of this sci-fi comedy. By contrast, I really did not remember much stuff about the characters. I can probably remember 3 character names right now. Arthur Dent, who's the protagonist, Ford Prefect, who's the alien, and then Zaphod, who's another alien with 2 heads, and that's pretty much it I can remember. And you would think that a character with 2 heads would be pretty memorable. Now, this is not a criticism by any means, because The Hitchhiker's Guide to the Galaxy, is a wonderful book. I really love it. And the fact that it doesn't have very good characters or, an amazingly riveting plot, is actually not necessarily a bad thing, because the comedy really compensates for that, and you're not reading this book for the characters or the plot necessarily. You're reading it for the comedy and for the wacky incidents and scenes that people run into as they journey through the galaxy. And a great tool to explain why this is okay and why this works so well is this thing called the mice quotient. And this comes from Orson Scott Card, who is the author of Ender's Game, among other novels. So here's the quote that explains him explaining the mice quotient. That was kind of a redundancy anyway, but let's go. Quote, "What are the different kinds of stories? Forget about publishing genres for a moment. There isn't one kind of characterization for academic literary stories, another kind for science fiction, and still others for westerns, mysteries, thrillers, or historicals. Instead, let's look at 4 basic factors present in every story, with varying degrees of emphasis. Balancing these factors determines what sort of characterization a story must have, should have, or can have. The 4 factors are milieu, idea, character, and event." A summary. Milieu. A milieu story concerns the world surrounding the characters you create. Idea. An idea story concerns the information you intend the reader to uncover or learn as they read your story. Character. A character story concerns the nature of at least one of the characters in your story, specifically what this character does and why they do it. Event. An event story concerns what happens and why it happens. End quote. And I'll put the link to the full article that explains that in the show notes for this. So what's this saying? Basically, this is saying that you can kind of categorize any kind of story into either being about milieu, about the setting, about the world, an idea, kind of about this like big picture concept. A lot of sci-fi stuff falls into this category. Character, a kind of character study piece or whatever, or event, more plot-driven stories, which are more about probably the kind of thing you would see more in like thrillers and action stories and stuff like that. Which one of these categories does The Hitchhiker's Guide to the Galaxy fall into? Well, I would say that it definitely falls into milieu, because this story is not really particularly concerned with character study or getting into the psychology of the characters. It's not really concerned with having an amazingly riveting, tight plot, and it's not really concerned with kind of this big theoretical idea that it's exploring. It's more exploring the milieu, the fantastical, wacky, whimsical, outrageously funny world of Douglas Adams' sci-fi galaxy. And the point here is that it's common to think that you need good characterization for your story to be good. And I would certainly recommend that, it's stories with good characters tend to be good stories. But sometimes stories need to focus on other things. Sometimes they need to focus on the world. And that's exactly what the Hitchhiker's Guide to the Galaxy does. Stuffed up that pronunciation there. This is a story that focuses on the world. It doesn't pretend to be this intricate character study, or it doesn't pretend to be this fast-paced plot. It realizes that what it does really well is the world, the milieu, the setting of the story, and it doubles down on that. The book is literally marketing itself as a guide to the galaxy, so it better explore that galaxy really well. So in conclusion, I kind of touched upon extracts and scenes and tools and, parts of the Hitchhiker's Guide to the Galaxy that I found really funny in this episode. And basically we looked at why you don't need to do anything in writing. These are all just recommendations. Anytime someone says you need to do something, that might not necessarily be correct. But it's useful, let's keep it at that, to try to identify in your own stories what it's about. Is your story mostly concerned with the setting? Is it mostly concerned with this idea? Maybe that's, dinosaurs roam the earth or something. Or everyone has a computer in their brain. Is it more focused on diving deep into a specific character? Or is it more about the event, more about the plot? And by no means does this have to be mutually exclusive. A lot of great stories combine all of this stuff. Maybe the story looks at the milieu and the character or something like that. It's just useful to know what your kind of main focus can be so that you can double down on it and make it as good as possible. Now, at the start of this episode, I mentioned that this is a 2-parter. And that's because the second part comes out this time next week. If you're listening live, if you're listening more than a week after this episode came out, you can listen to it right now. And in that, I'm going to be diving deeper into the Hitchhiker's Guide to the Galaxy, and specifically looking at how you can write comedy, because I think Hitchhiker's Guide to the Galaxy is a story with almost near universal comedic appeal. A lot of people say it's, some of the funniest stuff they've read, and it's definitely one of the funniest books that I've read myself. So I will see you next time, and thanks for listening to this episode of the Novel Analyst Podcast. See ya. Thanks for listening to the Novel Analyst Podcast. If you want to support the show, I'd really appreciate if you took the time to leave a quick rating and/or review on some podcast platforms like iTunes. Takes less than 20 seconds. You just scroll down to the bottom of the podcast feed, tap the star rating. Hopefully you'll give me 5 stars. If you don't want to give me 5 stars, that's cool as well, but maybe keep your opinions to yourself if it's not 5 stars. Or just leave any text review and I will be sure to read every single review that is put there. Thanks again for listening, and I will see you next time.